Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Today we welcome back Dr. Ashley Finley, Vice President of Research and Senior Advisor to the President for the Association of American Colleges and Universities. Ashley has a long career in higher education, including AAC&U, where she was the National Evaluator for the Bringing Theory to Practice project, as well as having been the Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs and Dean at Dominican University of California and at Dickinson College. AAC&U just published their recent study, On the Same Page, Administrator and Faculty Views on What Shapes College Learning and Student Success. And Ashley, as author and principal investigator, joins us to discuss its implication on higher education curriculum and how employers and faculty/administrators' views differ on what's being taught, and what we can do to change that to make the college education experience more relevant and meaningful to employers and students. Ashley, welcome back to the program.
Hi, Drumm. It's great to be with you.
Oh, great to have you back again. And of course, the big news is AAC&U has issued a new report.
We have issued what is the second part of our campus stakeholder survey. We've been doing that for a number of years. And so this is the updated version. And the first part of that report was around strategic priorities and challenges on campuses. Because we had collected so much data, we thought that we really wanted to focus on strategic priorities and the challenges confronting campuses, and then have a whole second half that was really focused on what outcomes are shaping undergraduate education and the practices that are guiding faculty and other stakeholders in the work that they're doing on campuses and supporting student learning and success.
Well, let's unpack that, because for me, the starting point is the report you issued last fall about what employers need. A little background on that for us, if you would, please.
So that the report that you're referencing came out in 2021 based on a survey we had launched in 2020. The name of the report is How College Contributes to Workforce Success, Employer Views on What Matters Most. And AAC&U's employer research has been going since 2005. We do a new survey or new research study about every couple or a few years. The last time we had done this was in 2018. So this was our pandemic research, if you will, and a chance to catch employers and then catch the attention of campuses at a really critical time of what's happening in higher education.
Well, that's neat. And we talked about that in our last podcast, but just as a refresher, there were 5 top takeaways that employers wanted for graduates: teams, critical thinking, the ability to analyze, interpret data, application of knowledge in real-world settings, and digital literacy.
Those were the top 5 in this report. And specifically what you're referencing is we have, since 2005, asked employers, what are the skills that you value the most, or that you're most looking for example, in hiring recent college graduates. And so we have, for a period of time, been effectively sort of seeing what rises to the top. I will say that over time, whether it's critical thinking has been at the top in certain years, communication has been oral communication was at the top in 2018. Teamwork rose to the top this time. There have always been some pretty consistent ones in the mix at the top. So I would say it's, in terms of trend data, it's looking like what's sort of consistently at the top. We see those. One of the things that's consistently at the bottom are civic skills. which continues to disappoint us as an association dedicated to the liberal education of students, but it's a disappointment to campuses too. Of course, their civic missions are at the heart of their mission statements and the heart of the role that they play in their community. So I think that's certainly not an issue of good things happening, a lack of good things happening. I think it's much more of an issue of transparency and then also the language that we're using around civic skills.
It could very well be, but it also makes me wonder, and this is a complete aside, is how much do folks actually look at higher education as a public good?
It's a great question, but the history of higher education going back to the Morrill Act, for example, and establishing the land-grant universities was very much done with an idea of providing economic vitality within communities, opening greater access. In the 60s, with the expansion of community college, was absolutely done with, again, a sort of nod toward increasing access. And I think, Drumm, maybe even to your specific point, the way in which colleges and universities have been shaping the public good is certainly about economic vitality and making sure that the workforce is trained in a way that's going to contribute to the overall financial impact of the community and the nation and the world at large. But that civic element, right? So that idea that we're preparing students to act and equip them with the capacity to act within a democracy goes back to Thomas Jefferson, the founding of the University of Virginia, and even the Truman Commission report. It really sort of speaking to thinking about what is the public good.
Mm-hmm. Well, that makes perfect sense. And of course, I guess my liberal bias came out on that question.
Well, it's a great question, of course. It's a great question, particularly in the face of declining public funding, right? So there's the tension there between what's at the heart of missions, which is always some nod to how students should behave and act in the world as citizens and contributors to their communities, both economically, right, and then civically, but then the tension of declining public funding, both at the federal and the state level. So it's like, whose burden is this to bear if higher education is contributing to the public good?
Yeah, well, it makes sense. And I think we need to move on because we can keep going down this rabbit hole for a long time.
Okay, all right.
And that was my fault. So anyway, your new report I think is really, really neat. It's entitled On the Same Page, Administrator and Faculty Views on What Shapes College Learning and Student Success. So it's broken down into 3 parts, learning outcomes. Are they understood, articulated, and how do they compare to workforce priorities? Nuances on curricular design, and then examination on assessment practices, which we may or may not get into. But let's talk about that first part, because to me, that's the crux of the matter. And that's where it comes into the previous report that you issued, student learning outcomes. Do students understand what learning outcomes are?
Oh, that's such a wonderful point. And in fact, on page 9 of the report, we actually provide what I think is a startling graphic of over a period of time since it reports on, since we started in 2008, reports on data from 2008, 2015, and then 2020, and this latest report. A couple of different bullet points. One, asking campuses, do you have learning outcomes? And then a follow-up question, to what degree do you perceive that students understand, all or most students understand those outcomes? And in our 2020 findings, we found the largest gap between the high number of campuses reporting that they have indeed identified learning outcomes. 83% of respondents reported, yes, my campus does have identified learning outcomes. And then to that perception question, which is simply asking them, to what degree do you believe all or most students understand your learning outcomes? Only 28% thought all or most students did. And that's, again, just a startling kind of gap. That was the largest gap. It's been substantial in the other years, but this was by far the lowest. We have 55% gap between those two things.
Why is that important?
It's critical because we have long talked about, and this is sort of the root of naming the report, what we did, On the Same Page, ? We have known for a long time that campuses really suffer from a lack of communication, transparency, and that comes at all levels. That comes from senior administrators down to deans and the faculty work down to students. And it's really sort of saying, if we value certain skills and capacities at this institution, if we are in fact organizing work in such a way that we think we are leading to those outcomes, do people know what we're doing? Are we effectively all kind of rowing in the same direction? And at the end of the day, can we talk about it? Do we have a kind of even common language for what the overall contribution is for the curriculum and the co-curriculum that we've designed for students? And it's just as important for students to be able to articulate those things as it is for any other stakeholder on campus to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm. And, I would see a difference between how faculty perceive this and how administration perceives this.
That's correct. And I would hasten to add that in having talked a couple of times about this report and having to a little bit kind of be in the position of explaining a little bit, why do I think we found our biggest, almost like a dramatically bigger gap in those perceptions in this latest report. And there's something that's really important to make a distinction with, and that's important to sneak in here. For the other reports that we've done around campus surveys, the 2008, the 2015 report, we had really only tapped one person to speak for campuses. We had effectively sort of tapped the chief academic officer, or some representative of the chief academic officer, to take this survey and to report back on what their institutional practices were. In this report, for this study, we wanted to diversify that. We were really interested in what do we think about how different stakeholders perceive what's going on. Faculty, deans and directors, and senior administrators being the three big groups that we disaggregated by. And frankly, I don't know, but I believe that is why we're seeing such a big gap this time around, simply because we included bigger points of perceived knowledge about what's going on campuses. And that had a whole range of impact. And you're exactly right. Where we found our biggest gaps were between faculty and senior administrators all throughout the survey, which was also a nod to why we decided to title it as we did, because we simply found such a difference between not only just the perceived difference between senior administrators and faculty and how they report out, but also the levels of uncertainty among faculty, because we simply, and on most questions, had an unsure category that they could check. And the relatively high and significantly higher percentages of faculty that would check that box versus deans and directors and for sure senior administrators.
Mm-hmm. Well, if the faculty aren't sure that students are learning the outcomes and understand the outcomes, that to me is a red flag.
It is, except for I would nuance that a little bit. I would say it was less uncertainty about what outcomes matter, but there was more uncertainty in sort of other pockets or areas. For example, if equity goals had been defined for the achievement of learning outcomes, certain assessment practices, the degree to which rubrics were being used on campus. Those were some of the bigger points in which we saw greater levels of uncertainty around faculty. And that's a bigger statement around communication around campus priorities, making sure faculty have the space and the audience to talk through what some of these campus priorities are. But certainly, to your point, it's definitely an endorsement for greater levels of communication.
Well, to me, it goes to a lack of shared vision. Why are we here? What are we supposed to be doing?
Absolutely. And collaborating on what that might look like. And I think even specifically, Drumm, how everybody plays a part in that shared vision, right? So I think so often strategic planning gets done and then the mission statement is, well, pretty rarely, but maybe it's revised or maybe and there's a feeling, right, that maybe that's done within the upper levels of administration, maybe in concert with the board of trustees. So I think there's better conversations that can be had about how everybody on campus contributes to that shared vision.
Well, I think about the way that we go about doing our strategic planning, and we have a core planning team, and then we have key stakeholder groups. And it's up to the core planning team to go out and facilitate sessions with these stakeholder groups and get their input so that they're not developing in a vacuum. And I don't see many institutions doing those kind of exercises to where they truly can get a shared vision.
I think that's right. And certainly the caveat at this point in time is what faculty and campuses in general have gone through because of the pandemic, students included. But I certainly hope that the more that we interrogate practices, the more that we're sensitive to disaggregating across stakeholder types, the more that we simply take into account that we value everybody's perspective and we value the role they play on campuses, maybe it is a bigger nudge to build just how crucial it is to build those spaces and build processes that way.
Mm-hmm. The institutions that I see that are the most successful are the ones who include the stakeholders, but they have a deep knowledge of how their particular roles impact and facilitate the mission of the institution. It's not just a cursory, oh yeah, we teach whatever. It's like, no, we teach this because it's important for what our mission is. And that mission is very unique per institution. It's not a cookie cutter thing.
Couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. And I know we might get to accreditation at some point, but it always inevitably sneaks into these conversations somewhere. And I will just say that I think anytime a campus goes through the accreditation process, it is always an opportunity to do exactly what you just described. The accreditation process done well will be organized with thoughtfully designed working groups that are regularly meeting, that have been assigned tasks, where that division of labor is coordinated, and there is collaboration and feedback built in from the very beginning through the very end of that process. It's always an opportunity to really establish those kinds of values.
Mm-hmm. And at the same time, I think it's important from a decision-making process, the RACI model: responsible, accountable, consult, and inform. Faculty at this point have the full say in what goes into curriculum. But there's a challenge, which kind of is, thank you for this segue. This is wonderful. There's a difference between what faculty are teaching and what employers feel are the most valuable skills that they need.
We have a comparison in the report on taking that latest employer study and comparing it with what we found for stakeholders. I agree and disagree. I think some of what we find from what campuses report are consistently found within their identified learning outcomes are the same as employers. They're similar, like in terms of communication skills, critical thinking skills. You even share some of the bottom ones, which is like terms like creative thinking. I do think a big difference is the way in which employers value teamwork and how rarely that appears within campus priorities. And even though there's a strong belief in collaboration, there's a strong belief in group projects, for example, but I think there's just that sort of next level of translation of, well, then what does it mean to really identify that as a core objective or even a competency at this institution? What does it look like to identify what teamwork looks like? Now, the state system level, the state of Texas has identified teamwork as a core priority at the system level. So that's a tremendous kind of exemplar of how that might look and how that might motivate campus work in that regard. But I do think it's one that is a big point of difference between the two lists.
Yeah, and you mentioned teams, but there's also the application in real world digital literacy. Those were 3 of the top 5 from your previous.
Yeah, you're very right about that. Well, I think campuses are a little late to the digital literacy game. I think we might see that, quite frankly. And I would also add, AAC&U is in the process right now of updating our essential learning outcomes framework, which has been widely adopted by colleges and universities. In fact, the development of that list back in 2005 served as the kind of North Star for the proof of concept that was our initial employer study. We wanted to see if employers got the language of that kind of framework, which, consistently they have. But we are in the process right now of updating that because it came out officially in 2007. It's been about 15 years and the world's changed. And I suspect, I can't say because we're going to do a public commentary period and we'll have some time to develop it, but I wouldn't be surprised if digital literacy ends up in our final list. And that would be a great nudge for campuses to be thinking about that for sure.
Mm-hmm. Well, I come back to, again, accreditation and shared governance, with these kind of things. Faculty, my experience, I need to qualify that, is that most faculty are not looking to what employers want from graduates.
Yes, I think you're exactly right. Though I don't want to suggest it's a willful ignorance. I think
not at all.
We have, again, a tension and a prioritization of how faculty have been trained, how they prioritize what is necessary in their own minds around what an educated person looks like. Mm-hmm. And many times that educated person looks like a depth of knowledge in a field. And we too often obscure the skills that necessarily come with the creation of new knowledge. And just even speaking from my own disciplinary lens as a sociologist, I had fantastic, amazing training, shout out to the University of Iowa. And I was consistently told in my graduate training, what I'm being equipped to do is to create new knowledge as a sociologist, which of course meant having all the tools and a deep knowledge of how all those tools work, methods and theories and so forth. But what got obscured in that, and what I've come to appreciate since then, is my ability to critically think and problem solve and integrate and apply and all the lovely things on that list and collaborate and et cetera. Collaboration has never meant more than it does in any of the disciplines, I think, for example. And I think that is absolutely the nudge that we continue to try to push with our forefronting of the employer study that we do, our forefronting of the campus stakeholder report, is really saying, what is implicit in the work that we do that we just need to make more explicit? And I feel like that might be part of the disconnect of faculty simply acknowledging that we really are talking the same kind of language. And I think particularly maybe for liberal arts faculty, and it's a little bit different for faculty in some of the professional programs who might have more of a lens toward that. But certainly liberal arts faculty couldn't be harmed by thinking about how those skills are transferable.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've got, many different specialty accreditors, AAC, not AAC&U, but, ACC, SB, AB, CSP, there's too much alphabet soup.
There's a lot of letters out there. ABET and the engineering accreditors and the education accreditor. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
And when you go through those accreditation, most of them specify what are the current trends going on. They don't say it quite like that, but to update curriculum to be able to do that. You don't see that with these kind of skills because these are more, I don't know what you'd call them, not personality skills, but, tendencies.
We certainly call them skills, but there's many other kinds of labels. If people were to look, for example, at our value rubrics, our valid assessment of learning in undergraduate education, rubrics that were designed to assess students' cognitive development around these skills over time, you would often see the language of habits of mind.
Yes, that's a good way.
In fact, sort of suggesting that critical thinking and problem solving and really any one of these skills per se is effectively a habit of mind. We want students to look at the world this way. I had a conversation with a faculty member the other day and faculty member was in history, was in a different discipline than I was. And I just happened to mention around this very idea of habits of mind. I said, in sociology, we have this way of talking about the sociological imagination. It's sociology 101. It's simply a lens that we put on and how we view the world. And she said, oh my gosh, I really love that. We don't have something quite like that in terms of a term, but it was a good reminder for me sometimes of how even our own disciplinary training gives us a way in for thinking about some of these things sometimes. Mm-hmm.
And it's nice because there are some accreditors, Northwest and WASC come to mind, who have these kind of core competencies built into their standards, like critical thinking.
That is correct. And having been at a campus that was under WASC accreditation, I do know that. I do know that well. Though I think, for example, the value rubrics and AAC&U, so a learning outcomes framework, is endorsed. Certainly, the value rubrics are endorsed as an effective form of assessment by any of the accreditors, and that it always feels like a nod toward the valuing forgive the pun, the valuing of broad and transferable skills that exist at that level that might be shared and built through general education all the way up through the major.
Mm-hmm. And so I think this is a good jumping off point to talk about something that your survey explored for the first time, mindsets.
Thank you for bringing it up. Yes, knowing that we were going to be revising the essential learning outcomes framework and knowing that there's a rich amount of scholarship and literature on the role of and forgive the language. I think the language is a little squishy here. It can be called a number of different things. We've gone with mindsets, aptitudes, and dispositions because it just seems to be a place where most people can agree we kind of get what we're talking about there. So we've called them that. But so for example, growth mindset, self-authorship, thriving, flourishing, belonging, self-confidence. I could go on. And when you begin to say these things to a campus or to a group of faculty, you don't say them to a campus, but when you say them on a campus to stakeholders, heads begin to nod. There's a recognition of how powerful these kinds of capacities are in supporting the learning process, emboldening the learning process, increasing student success, major implications for equity, and yet they don't quite fit into a bucket. They don't quite fit someplace. It's certainly not an AAC&U's learning outcomes framework. Not quite an intellectual and practical skill, not quite a civic skill, not knowledge, it didn't have a place to go. And so one of the things that we'll be doing in updating the learning outcomes framework is effectively adding a category for this. Now we will, again, through public commentary, figure out what exactly the language is, what has the most resonance, but we also wanted the evidence base for saying that we know from even our own research that these kinds of capacities matter. And we found through the employer report that certain of these motivation, for example, and there are motivation researchers out there. We have a wonderful one on our team at AAC&U, Jessica Chittum, terrific motivation researchers out there, but motivation, work ethic, ability to take initiative, these things rose straight to the top for employers as highly as any other kind of skill. And the same for campus stakeholders. Now it was a little different. They valued certain things a little bit differently there. But in general, as a group, we knew we were onto something. We know we're onto something.
Well, to me, these are the intangibles. They're what makes, they can make or bake. Yeah, you've got to have your knowledge, your ability to write, critical thinking. But if you don't have a work ethic, if you don't have the ability to take initiative, and you don't have self-confidence, which just happen to be the three top from the employers, you're not going to be successful as a graduate.
Agreed. I talked to an industry leader a year ago or so and sort of talking about this kind of work. And she gave me sort of a lovely typology for thinking about it. And in her work, she works with companies of all sizes and different sectors working on strategic planning, management. And she sort of referred to the idea of job skills, which are, very specific jobs, things that you would need to do to complete a task in a job, about as specific as you can get. And then she referred to sort of next layer as kind of enabling skills, sort of like the idea that, you need to critical thinking, you problem solving as a way to do your job better, right? So things don't go the same way every day and you need to be able to adapt, right? That next layer, what you're saying are the invisible ones. And what we are calling sort of the mindsets, aptitudes, dispositions, that sort of internal layer. She referred to, she called them aptitudes, but the descriptor was important. And it was, these are the things that help you move up.
Mm-hmm.
She was like, in our research, we know that they're not necessarily, people can be high and low on different components of all of these things. But when they're high on those aptitudes, that is what leads to promotions.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just, again, this is why it's so helpful to talk to different people and get different points of view on it. But I sort of love that in terms of thinking about how do we paint an entire picture of what student success looks like? And how do we take those capacities, those mindsets and dispositions very seriously in what we do?
As you should. What's interesting for me is there's a subtle difference between what campus says should be your top mindsets and what employers, I mentioned the employers already, work ethic, agency, the ability to take initiative, and self-confidence. On the campus, their top one was curiosity, the capacity for lifelong learning. Makes sense. It's an academic institution. Persistence can be related to work ethic. And then agency, the ability to take initiative in both lists. So it's not that far off.
I agree. Resilience is up there too.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, again, I'm trained as a sociologist to look at what rises to the top and kind of what goes to the bottom. Like these are where the trends are. So I always look at both. And what's interesting, Drumm, on both of the lists for employers and for campus stakeholders, emotional intelligence was at the bottom. And I don't want to say that it was ranked lower. It wasn't a ranking question. It was simply, how important, and these were the percentages of respondents in general saying this is very important. So that's what's going on here. But a lower percentage of respondents saying emotional intelligence was very important. And I just flagged that because it was something, it's a kind of a term du jour. It sort of floats around, and it was interesting to sort of put it to the test and see if it stood up with all the others.
Well, it is interesting, and it's not surprising given where we are in our political milieu, however you want to term it. There has been a lot of conversation out there about the cancel culture and students not feeling comfortable, faculty not feeling comfortable having the kind of academic debates that they used to. And students, they'll say there was an article in the Chronicle just a couple of days ago, an opinion by a student who said that many of her colleagues and herself won't say their opinion because they don't want to be shamed, whether it be by the professor or the other student. They're afraid of losing friends. To me, that goes directly to emotional intelligence and the ability to have that conversation, those difficult conversations, and keep your mind open to other perspectives. Our perspective is our perspective, and it may or may not be what other people have. I can always learn from other people.
I agree. I agree. And, I think it wasn't a surprise that 3 out of 5 respondents on the campus stakeholder survey reported empathy as being very important. I think the question is, Drumm, to that very specific point is, I think we have a much better sense on campuses, just with you, the N of one, my own experience and having worked for a long time at AAC&U and worked with lots of campuses. I think there is a feeling right now that we need to be doing better on campuses to support students and to support voice, right? To support perspectives from a whole range, a real sensitivity to freedom of expression for sure on campuses. I think to even the specific report, the follow-up to the mindsets question was, I'm paraphrasing here. I'm putting it I'm speaking how the survey would have sounded if we were doing an interview with it. But it was sort of saying, okay, great. These things are important to you. Where are they happening? Where is it on your campus that you're investing in that students actually have these mindsets or aptitudes? And it won't come as any surprise to people reading the report that they're almost consistently found in the co-curriculum. Now, that's great. And we hope that they were somewhere. But we need to take seriously that they need to be part of the formal curriculum at the same time, the co-curriculum, for them to be taken seriously, to be elevated and made as explicit as they can be, for us to really think about what does it mean to develop empathy and resilience within our campuses and those capacities within students. They've got to be tethered to the learning process and really reinforced explicitly through our disciplines. That's a game changer. It's a real paradigm shift for faculty. I absolutely believe it can be done. I believe there's some good work in this area, but it's going to have to happen much more.
It certainly is. And the default for many of these was, oh, this is done through student affairs. And it's like, no, it's not done through student affairs. It's done through life.
It is. And part of what, where student affairs and where our colleagues in student affairs are such great champions and such great collaborators on this work. We have the potential to collaborate with them even more in this particular area. Where they excel in student affairs is doing exactly that, is connecting students' experience on campus to their life experiences and harnessing the ways in which that can happen, whether it's work study or internships or volunteer experiences or alternative spring break. I mean, you name it. It's just that it can't be isolated there. And there's, and in all the enthusiasm of what can happen in the co-curriculum, it also doesn't have the same levels of accountability that the curriculum has. We don't attach credits to it. We don't grade it. It doesn't go on the transcript typically. So, this is where we really have to be thinking across both sides of the house, really thinking as a whole campus to support this work.
Wow. Holistic education. What a concept.
There you go. I said it here for the first time. No, not at all.
Very good.
It's all about taking it seriously. It's all about taking what we know is best for students and what we know is best for our institutions and really beginning to translate it into some actual practices.
Absolutely. And so, as usual, we've run out of time.
Always fun. It's always fun, Drumm.
I think you and I could probably talk for another 3/4 of an hour on this very easily.
No question. This one came up fast. I know we have tons more to talk about, and I so appreciate your questions.
Well, and I appreciate your being on the show. 3 takeaways for university presidents and boards.
100% to be thinking about the ways in which you're communicating those overall messages and transparency. If this report is saying anything we said at the top of our time together, I'll just reiterate it here: transparency and communication of those overall goals. A second thing, really focus on your equity goals and the establishing of equity goals. One of the key pieces in this study that we didn't get a chance to talk about in our time together is the degree to which assessment is happening on campuses and even disaggregating data. We ask campuses, are you just even disaggregating data so you have a sense of how your practices are varying across different groups of students? We see high levels of disaggregation, almost no establishing of equity goals. So what that's saying is almost no real reflection and transparency around what does it mean to succeed? What does it mean to actually close gaps between students and really support student success? So absolutely, that has to be one of the key takeaways. And I would say the final one, you're making me choose here, but I think the final one is to really think about how direct assessment is getting into assessment practices, how campuses are balancing what students think they can do with their actual demonstrated learning. That's going to become even more important as campuses take seriously the mindsets, aptitudes, and dispositions. How are we really asking students to demonstrate that they have these kinds of skills and capacities, just like critical thinking and other things? But that's going to continue to be a key piece of what campuses need to think about in terms of their assessment practices.
Sounds like you had one more you wanted to add.
The one I kind of snuck it into the third one. That is taking seriously the mindsets, aptitudes, and dispositions. That is exactly what we just were closing with, of really thinking about what does it mean to build those shared practices, true, meaningful, authentic collaborations between academic and student affairs to develop those dispositions.
Very good. Thank you. What's next? What's next for you? What's next for AAC&U?
I would say 2 things. We are, as I mentioned, revising our essential learning outcomes framework. And so we will be opening that up for a public comment period. Oh my gosh, I'm going to say it here and I'm going to have to hold myself to it probably within the next couple of weeks, and then be revising it from there. So hopefully by the end of the summer, hopefully for the fall, we'll have that updated framework. We're very excited about that. And then the second thing is we have launched a civic evidence project. So we are now working with 31 campuses, including all 16 public institutions in the state of Utah, to work with the civic engagement value rubric and to be collecting evidence of students' demonstrated civic engagement associated with their community-based practices on those campuses. And the point of that project is to begin to build what we think will be effectively the first national baseline for how campuses are building civic capacities in students.
Wow, that's big.
Really excited. Yeah.
That is really, really big.
Thank you.
Well, Ashley, thank you so much for being on the program. It's been wonderful as always.
Thank you, Drumm. I really appreciated being here. Great to be with you.
You too. Thanks for listening this week. Special thank you to this week's special guest, Ashley Finley, Vice President for Research and Senior Advisor to the President at the Association of American Colleges and Universities, and for her sharing with us what employers want in college graduates. Our next guest is Mike Petrelli, President of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. Mike will be joining us to talk about his most recent article, The Upside of the Downward Trend in Enrollment, and the steps that higher education institutions must take to remain relevant.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.